Right, well I'll start with a reassembly here. Get those two screws snugged up. Check that that moves freely. Normally I put a bit of graphite powder in there and work it in a bit. I don't use oil or grease in a position like that because you have broad flat surfaces and oils and greases can stick things together like glue. So a bit of graphite powder is good. And then I'll just blow that powder out and then fit the return spring now. There are various methods used on the Retina IIc series for returning the shutter release. This is probably the most common variant. That spring is wanting to pop off there, that's a bit better, and hook that spring over the correct side of that shaft there. Here we go, that's our return spring. Make sure that's snug. That part's done. Next, the buttons. Now one of these buttons was sticking for no obvious reason. I put a thin smear of grease in there. The same at this end. The two buttons are identical and their two springs likewise. So the springs go into the holes in the button, they do not go over the post of the button. If you put them over the post, nothing's going to work. That's one. You'd think I'd come to some understanding with technology, but I haven't. It was just the camera telling me that it had run out of storage space on the card, so we've got a new card. Anyway, buttons in. Front of the camera all assembled. Some very odd scarring at this point here. Sort of suggests someone had a poke in there in the front of the camera to adjust or play with the shutter release at some stage. That part moves very freely. I'm going to lubricate that now. On the two rails, top and bottom, that's where the lens standard slides on the shroud, down those two rails. So using some synthetic grease there, I'll just run it down those rails. That's good. And the buttons pop up here and here. And so likewise, I'm just running a bit of synthetic grease there and there, particularly at the top there where that track is for the rangefinder. That makes it a little bit rougher and it's a bit more reluctant to run. Okay, that looks good. This component is part of the shutter release. That sits in there. If I fold the front back in, that'll stop that from falling out while I work on the rest of this. And the rest of this, what have we got? Well, we've got our transfer shaft that takes the action from the cocking rack through to the shutter. and that sits in this little hollow here, so I've put some synthetic grease on that. Here's the bracket that holds that in position. Drop that in place. Supporting that from underneath with my finger, I can line up this screw hole. There is one small round-headed screw that sits in there. I'll run that loosely up. Next, that bracket has to have sufficient clearance for this cocking rack to slide behind it. Too much clearance and the cocking rack and the gear will drift apart from each other and they won't be bearing on their full width of the teeth on each other. So that space needs to be controlled. And I have found from experience that a 4/1000th of an inch clearance works very good in practice. That's good, that rack's moving smoothly. That's all I need to do there. Now it's usually, where are we? Here we go. Let's get this front piece in. Slide this into position. We have 4 screws that hold this in. They are usually the ugliest screws on the camera because they have been very awkward to install and remove. 2 of them are ugly with applied paint or glue too, so you can usually tell which ones go where. These ones are exceptionally mutilated, which suggests to me that somebody has had them out at some stage in the past, someone other than me. That just displaced the bush that it's supposed to screw into. So I've got to see if I can recover from that little error. First thing I need to do is put my shutter release shaft in place so that this little arm in here can't fall out, or is less likely to fall out. And supporting that with my finger, I've got to find that bush. There it is, and get that back into position. There are 4 bushes in the shroud, and unfortunately one of them is positioned right next to the edge of the metal, so it's not very well supported, and inevitably it comes loose when you're trying to get the screw started in it, which is exactly what's happened in this case. They're squared off on one side, so they only go in one way round. They are awkward to position. And since that's being such a pain, I'm just going to remove this piece completely again and start again. Let's take that out of here, fold up that front slightly. Where's the bush go? The bush goes here. Now I did see a camera recently where somebody had glued those in and the glue had gone bloody everywhere. It was a real nuisance. Right, let's see if we can get one screw started in that bush first, because that's the one that wants to come loose. No, it's just going to keep coming loose. Right, let's get that screw back out. I'm going to have to use a different tactic here. Where's the bush gone? There it is. I will have to fit this with the front extended and put my finger in there and support that bush from inside. Which means this piece here is in danger of falling out. Let's see how we get on. It did fall out. Fold that in slightly. Get that in position. The screw I want to use is that one. Put my shutter release shaft in there to support that piece. Extend the front out. Put my finger in from underneath and support that bush. Take the screw, get it started. Look at that. No worries. Easy when you know how. Well, these screws are exceptionally ugly. I'll collapse that front back down because otherwise I'm sure I'll end up losing something. That's better. And at the base of the camera we have two screws. These ones are marginally uglier even. Once all four screws are in position, the screws can be tightened. I can tell by the distortion on those screw heads that somebody has tightened them up very tight previously. See if I can get those damaged threads of metal loose from there and blow the buggers away. I don't want them falling off and clogging the mechanism by themselves. That's better. Okay, so there's the front of the cam, the front standard all in place, and the shroud is all in place. So far so good. This can go in now. This is the focus mount. So the focus mount just fits down into the front standard and is held to the front standard by 4 screws, which are nickel plated, fairly long, rounded heads on them. I'll just get those running. Excuse me. Right, let's get those screws run down. Just run them lightly down. Once they're all seated, go around and tighten them all up. Extend the front back out. The focus helical needs to be assembled and put into the body. So we've got our alignment marks on here. I'm trying to find them. I can see 2 lines here and 1 opposite. Okay, so those are probably my marks. Alright, let's see how we go. That's a bit stiff, that's quite normal. I've got absolutely no lubricant on them, they're straight out of the cleaner. And I'm about 1 or 2 notches out there. This is a multi-start thread. Another notch. Let's try that. There we go. Oh, that's looking very promising. That's us. That's in the right position. The inner and outer helical are aligned correctly together. I'm just working this with a bit of naphtha in the thread to polish off any roughness that's there. That feels fine. So some helical grease would be the answer next. So I'll back that almost all the way out, and I want to apply my grease in about 5 spots around here. And work that in. You don't need to put a lot of grease into the helical, and it's certainly of no advantage to have it completely clogged with grease. That is counterproductive. You just need a little bit of lubricant. I'll run some around the outside, some in the slots where it runs on the guide rails. Now I know this goes in the body with the two scribe marks down and the upper one scribe mark up, because that's the way I always do it. Everybody has their own particular favourite way of doing that. It doesn't matter, as long as you know where things came from and you can confidently put them back in the same place, you're golden. Right, a little bit of grease on here. There's only really 4 spots that tends to contact, which is right where the screws hold that bracket down, of course. This only goes on in one position, which isn't there, it's there. There are 4 countersunk head screws that hold this in place. And I can see I'm getting ahead of myself here because I've got screws lined up here for the focus scale ring, and I have not got the screws lined up for the bellows that hold the bellows to the front standard, which of course have to go on first. So to get these 4 screws in place, tighten them up. Check that that moves smoothly, it does. Collapse the front, and there are 4 screws, long black screws that go through the mount and hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. So far so good. All the screws are present and correct. As usual, get all 4 screws started. Once the screws are all started, go around and tighten them up. Don't overdo it, they're only quite small screws, and you're pulling up against the bellows, the folded leather and so forth of the bellows, so there's a bit of give. Right, that's all good. Let's pull that forward, and we want our focus scale ring, which is here, and that needs to be aligned with the scribe marks that we put top and bottom. So I'm making sure I've got those alignments correct. You can often tell where they've come from by marks, faint marks from where the screw heads have been previously. There are certainly marks there, but they're a little bit vague, like they shifted in position at some stage. We'll go by the marks that I made and make a note to check the focus carefully once the camera is fully assembled. these screws need to be done up, just nipped up. They don't need to be done up tight. If you do them up tight, all you'll end up doing is distorting the focus scale ring or the outer helical, and then you will find it difficult to adjust the focus. It'll be too stiff. This piece, this has been through the cleaner, so this little rivet point there is quite tight. I need to put some lubricant back on that spot because all the lubricant's been washed out. Right, so this is typically the only spot on the camera I ever use any oil. So I'll pick up a tiny drop of oil on the tip of a screwdriver, drop it into that joint there, and just work that, and instantly that's working exactly as it should. If I put nothing in there, because I've washed out all the solvent, that would be stiff and it wouldn't move as smoothly as it should do. Right, so this can go in. This is our coupling for the rangefinder. Just checking I can find the piece at the top. I can. So it's held to the inner helical with two tiny screws. Both in place, I can tighten them up. And at the top is a single screw, a guide post if you like, that couples to our rangefinder. There it is. Nip that up. Now I usually put a spot of grease in here into that slot behind in the head of that screw head. And as you move the focus, you can see that that pulls that pin forward or backwards. And as you close the front of the camera, just line up this shaft here, so I can close the front of the camera. As you close the front of the camera, that whole thing disappears down that track, out of sight and tucked away. That allows you to actually fold the front of the camera. If it didn't hinge, you wouldn't be able to do that. Right, so far so good. Now the coupling here for cocking the shutter is this piece. This piece, let's have a look. Is that all I've got in this one? Yes. There's a couple of changes made in the design of this, but this is how this one's made. Some of them have an extra guide piece that goes in here. So I'm putting some grease here, a little wipe of grease on the inside where it sits over that shaft. Extend that right out now. Be careful not to lose my shutter release at this stage. I'll put just a tiny wipe of grease on the front face of that where it runs on this piece, this bush at the front, which I think is also referred to as the shroud in the parts list. There are two chrome screws. They are awkward to get at and easily damaged, so make sure you keep the pretty one for the top one, because that's the one that people can actually see. If one of them is slightly damaged, make it the bottom one where people can't actually see it. That way the camera will appear to be perfect even if it's not. Here we go, and check that the focus scale ring moves smoothly, that the scale is not rubbing on this shroud. That seems very good. Front opens and closes smoothly. I think we're good to go. What am I looking for? The rewind post. I want to get that in because I want to take a rubber band from here to the rewind post so that I don't lose my shutter release, otherwise it will be a nuisance. If the shutter release falls out, that little arm down here can fall into the back of the camera. I've got to take all of this stuff out to put it back, which gets very annoying. Right, so some synthetic grease here. Wipe some of this on the internal part of the rewind shaft. Fit that in place. It's keyed. It only slots in one spot. That is not playing the game there. It's got a little detent spring on here and it doesn't want to go. That's that. Line that up with the slot. Yes, it's in. Some synthetic grease in the bush for the top here. And slide the shaft in place. Don't just force it in, just lift that tab very slightly. That'll allow that to pass through, and that's running smoothly. 2 screws hold that in place. Countersunk head screws, and unlike this one and this one, they are probably not mutilated, so they'll be quite pretty. Get the second screw in place, then tighten a pair of them up. Now I need to find that rubber band.